Hey folks, today we're tackling one of the most controversial and misunderstood topics in religious history, LGBTQ+ narratives hidden in the Bible. This isn't about rewriting scripture, it's about rediscovering marginalized voices. We'll explore ancient same-sex bonds, gender nonconforming heroes, and the cultural biases that shaped modern interpretations. Let's dive in. Part 1. Sodom and Gomorrah. What were the real sins? Let's start with the big one, Sodom. The story of Lot's visitors is often weaponized against queer people, but the text itself is murky. The mob demands to know the angels, Genesis 19 verse 5. The Hebrew word yada, to know, can mean sex, but also intimidation or domination. Compare this to Judges 19 verse 22, where the same phrasing describes a gang rape meant to humiliate, not pursue desire. Sodom's sin was violence, not homosexuality. Ezekiel 16 verse 49 condemns their neglect of the poor. Even Jesus references Sodom in the context of inhospitality, Matthew 10 verses 14 to 15. Why did later traditions fixate on homosexuality? Blame early Christian writers like Augustine, who linked Sodom to lust, not violence. Medieval art amplified this, erasing the original message of social justice. Part 2. David and Jonathan, brothers Oregon lovers? Queer theologian, Reverend Dr. Patrick Chung states, same-sex love wasn't taboo in many ancient cultures. The Hebrew Bible lacks a word for homosexual. Their bond transcends modern labels. However, a conservative pastor states, this is revisionism. David had multiple wives. Their relationship was a political alliance, not romantic. Both readings exist. But why does the romantic interpretation threaten people? Maybe because it challenges rigid views of masculinity and power. Part 3. Ruth and Naomi, a queer covenant. Ruth's vow to Naomi, where you go, I will go, Ruth 1 verse 16, is quoted in heterosexual weddings, but Ruth's loyalty defies patriarchal norms. She rejects her homeland to cling to another woman, forming a chosen family. The Hebrew word davik, cling, is the same used in Genesis 2 verse 24 to describe Adam and Eve's union. Dr. Will Gaffney states, Ruth and Naomi's story is a queer narrative of survival. They build a life in a society that valued women only through men. Part 4. The centurion's pious, a romantic partner? In Matthew's Gospel, a Roman centurion begs Jesus to heal his pious. The Greek word pious often meant a servant, but in Greco-Roman contexts, it could also mean a younger male lover. Jesus doesn't scold him, he praises his faith. Dr. James Neal states, same-sex relationships were common in Rome. The centurion's devotion to his pious would have been seen as noble, not sinful. However, but Jesus never condones the relationship, versus, he also never condemns it, unlike the Pharisees' hypocrisy. Part 5. Eunuchs, the Bible's gender nonconformists. Eunuchs appear over 40 times in the Bible. They were often gender nonconforming, barred from temples, Deuteronomy 23 verse 1, until Isaiah 56 verses 3 to 5 flips the script. To the eunuchs, I will give a name better than sons and daughters. Eunuchs were the trans and intersex people of antiquity. Acts 8's Ethiopian eunuch is baptized without question, a radical act of inclusion. Part 6. Deborah and Jael, queer coding in prophetic literature. Deborah, a female military leader, and Jael, who seduces and assassinates an enemy general, defy gender roles. Jael's act of violence, using a tent peg instead of a sword, subverts expectations of feminine passivity. Early Jewish midrash even hints at a romantic bond between the two women. Feminist scholar Dr. Phyllis Tribble states, the Song of Deborah, Judges 5, celebrates their triumph in erotic language. Most blessed of women be Jael, 5:24. It's a queer reclamation of power. Part 7. The Apocrypha's lost queer stories. Early Christian texts outside the canon brim with queer themes. The Gospel of Philip describes Jesus kissing Mary Magdalene on the mouth, while the Acts of Thomas includes a gender-fluid hymn, I am male and female, mother and father. Historian Dr. Susan Stryker states, "These texts show early Christianity's diversity. Orthodoxy erased them, but they survived in marginalized communities." Part 8. Paul's letters, misunderstood or bigoted. Paul's condemnation of men burning with lust for one another, Romans 1 verse 27, is a clobber verse. But the Greek terms arsenokoitai and malakoi are vague, likely referencing exploitative pederasty, not loving relationships. Linguist Dr. David Halpern states, arsenokoitai appears nowhere before Paul. He might have coined it to condemn temple prostitution, not same-sex intimacy. Part 9. Queer Jesus? Reimagining the Messiah. John's Gospel calls himself the disciple Jesus loved, John 13 verse 23, reclining on Christ's chest. Early Christians saw their bond as a spiritual marriage. The 14th century mystic Marguerite Porete even wrote of Jesus as a divine lover transcending gender. Queer theology Reverend Dr. Kittredge Cherry states, "Queer folks see Jesus as the ultimate outsider, a brown, radical, celibate man who defied norms. His message aligns with LGBTQ+ liberation." The Levite's concubine Judges 19 verses 22 to 26. A Levite traveler and his concubines seek shelter in Gibeah. A mob surrounds the house, demanding to know the Levite using the Hebrew yada, as in Sodom's story. The host offers his daughter and the concubine instead, but the mob rapes the concubine to death. Like Sodom, this story centers on violent inhospitality rather than consensual same-sex acts. The demand to know the Levite likely symbolizes domination, not desire. On the other hand, scholar Ken Stone notes that the text's horror lies in the violation of social codes, not homosexuality. The parallel to Sodom challenges modern anti-LGBTQ+ readings of both stories. Daniel and the eunuchs. Daniel 1 verses 3 to 9. Daniel and his friends are taken to Babylon and placed under the care of Ashpenaz, the chief eunuch. They resist assimilation but thrive under the eunuch's protection. Eunuchs in the ancient world often occupied fluid gender roles, serving as trusted officials in royal courts. Their castration, literal or symbolic, marked them as other. The story highlights alliances between marginalized figures, Daniel as a captive Jew, eunuchs as gender nonconforming. This mirrors queer experiences of finding community in exile. Joseph and Potiphar. Genesis 39 verses 1 to 20. Joseph, sold into slavery in Egypt, becomes overseer for Potiphar, a high-ranking official. Potiphar's wife falsely accuses Joseph of rape after he rejects her advances. Some Jewish midrashim, commentaries, imply Potiphar himself desired Joseph. The 10th century Targum Pseudo-Jonathan claims Potiphar bought Joseph for himself, but his wife intervened. The story's tension around desire and power can be read through a queer lens, especially given Joseph's vulnerability as an enslaved foreigner. The sin of Ham, Genesis 9 verses 20 to 27. After the flood, Noah becomes drunk and lies naked in his tent. His son Ham sees his nakedness and tells his brothers, who cover Noah without looking. Noah curses Ham's son Canaan. Ancient Jewish and Christian commentators, e.g., Philo, Augustine, speculated that Ham's sin was sexual, either castrating Noah, committing incest, or engaging in same-sex acts. The phrase, saw his nakedness, Hebrew araya erva, often implies sexual violation. Modern scholars like Michael Carden argue the story was later weaponized to justify racism and homophobia, but its ambiguity leaves room for queer reclamation. Conclusion: the Bible is a queer book. The Bible's queer stories aren't anomalies, they're proof that diversity is sacred. Whether you're religious or not, these narratives challenge us to read with humility. The next time someone weaponizes scripture against queer people, remember, the Bible's God is the one who made male and female, and every beautiful variation in between. Drop a comment with your thoughts. Dive deeper with the books linked below. Subscribe for part 2, where we'll explore queer saints and mystics. Stay curious, stay kind,